Luke left on a night the town would remember by feel, not by date. Headlights cutting through the cold, gravel popping under his tires, Megan standing in the doorway like a promise he couldn't keep. He said he needed to find himself, as if love were something you could pause, as if devotion could wait on a roadside while ambition drove ahead. And when the truck disappeared into the dark, what remained wasn't silence. It was the sound of a life breaking without an audience. Time didn't stop for grief. Seasons came like they always did in small towns. Spring rains swelling the riverbanks, summer heat baking the fields, harvest dust clinging to work boots, winter pressing its hand against every window. Megan kept moving through all of it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she refused to be undone by someone else's leaving. She learned to carry pain without letting it carry her. She didn't wait at the same door. She rebuilt, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. She showed up at the hospital when the night shifts were heavy. She helped neighbors when storms took down fences. She smiled again when she was ready, not when it was expected. And somewhere along the way, she became the kind of woman you don't abandon and expect to find unchanged. Then years later, when the town was caught between a fading autumn and first frost, Luke came back. Not with a grand speech, not with flowers or dramatic apologies. Just a man standing at the edge of the place he once ran from, successful on paper, humbled in the eyes, as if life had finally taught him the lesson he refused to learn in love. And the question that hung in the air wasn't whether Megan still loved him. It was whether he deserved to be near her at all. Because some doors don't reopen just because someone knocks. Some hearts don't return to what broke them, not unless the hands that caused the damage are willing to repair, slowly, faithfully, without demanding a reward. So tell me, was it too late? Or would this be the story where the man who left to find himself finally learns that the only love that mattered was the one he abandoned, and the only way back is through truth, patience, and actions that cost something? Stay until the end. Because when Luke finally stands in front of Megan again, it won't be a reunion scene. It will be a verdict. If you believe in second chances done right, subscribe and comment, "I stayed, so I know you're with us." The night Luke left, the town felt smaller than usual, like the cold had pushed every house closer together. Megan stood in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The clock above the sink ticked too loud, each second a warning she didn't want to accept. Luke paced near the back door, boots already on, jacket zipped, keys clutched like a decision. He didn't look at her for long, like her eyes might talk him out of whatever story he'd been repeating in his head. Outside, the wind dragged itself through bare branches and made the porch light flicker. And Megan knew with a kind of terrible clarity that this wasn't just a fight, this was an ending. Megan's voice came out steady, which surprised even her. She asked where he was going as if it were a normal question. Luke swallowed, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the screen door. "Just for a while," he said, like time was a small thing. Like leaving didn't carve years into people's ribs. Megan didn't raise her voice, didn't chase the drama of a scene. She simply waited for the truth to stop hiding behind words. He told her it wasn't about her, the oldest lie in the world. He said he needed to find himself, to become someone more than a man in a small town with dusty roads and familiar faces. More than a boyfriend who worked hard and still felt restless. He spoke of opportunities, of the city, of proving something to himself. But Megan heard what he didn't say. He was afraid of settling, of staying. Afraid that love would ask him to be fully known and fully responsible. On the table, a half-folded grocery list sat beside a jar of wildflowers. Megan had picked them that morning, thinking of nothing dramatic at all. Dinner smells still lingered, warm and ordinary, like a life that deserved to continue. Luke's suitcase stood by the door, small enough to suggest he planned to return. That detail stung more than it should have because it felt like a loophole, as if he could leave without admitting he was choosing a world without her in it, as if Megan would live on pause until he pressed play again. "So what am I supposed to do?" Megan asked, calm but sharp. Luke finally looked at her and the regret was already forming too early. "You'll be okay," he said like he was giving her a compliment. Megan's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from the humiliation of it, because he was turning her pain into a prediction he could live with. He was blessing her endurance so he wouldn't have to carry her heartbreak. And she realized he'd rehearsed this version of her, strong enough to leave behind. She didn't beg, because Megan didn't do desperation like a performance. She had been raised around women who worked through storms and didn't announce it. She had watched mothers patch roofs, bandage knees, and keep the lights on anyway. But being strong wasn't the same as being unhurt, and Luke didn't understand that. He confused her resilience with permission. He mistook her silence for acceptance. And while he spoke, Megan's heart made a decision of its own. She would not chase him. Luke's phone buzzed in his pocket, another reminder of his next. He glanced down and the movement was small, but Megan saw everything in it. He was already halfway gone. She stepped closer, not to stop him but to look at him clearly one last time. His face held that restless hunger, ambition wearing the mask of courage. Yet his hands trembled at the edges, like he knew he was about to damage something holy. Megan's eyes softened, not with surrender but with grief for the love they were burying. "If you leave," she said, each word carefully placed, "don't make me carry the blame." Luke flinched, like the truth was heavier than his suitcase. "I'm not blaming you," he insisted too quickly. But he didn't say, "I'm choosing you." He didn't say, "I'll fight for us." He didn't say, "I'm terrified but I'll stay." He only stood there, chasing an unknown future, while Megan stood in the present alone. Outside, the truck engine started, a low growl that felt like betrayal. The porch light painted Luke's shoulders in pale gold as he opened the door. Cold air rushed in, stealing warmth from the room like it had a right to. Megan followed him to the threshold, her bare feet on the worn wood. She looked past him at the empty road, the sleeping town, the quiet fields. Everything out there had roots, and Luke was choosing to live like roots were a weakness. He hesitated, turning as if he might say something that mattered. Megan held her breath, not hopeful, just human. Luke's eyes shone, and for a second he looked like the man she had trusted. Then he exhaled and said, "I'll call." 2 words that sounded like comfort, but carried no promise. Megan nodded once because she refused to give him tears to pack as souvenirs. Luke stepped down, and the distance between them grew in the simplest way, one stare at a time. The truck pulled away, headlights sweeping the yard like a goodbye wave. Megan didn't move until the sound faded into the wide mouth of night. When silence finally settled, it wasn't peaceful. It was accusing. She closed the door slowly as if speed might make her break. Her hand rested on the knob longer than necessary, fingers tight. In that moment, the kitchen felt too big, like love had been the furniture holding it together. And Megan realized she was going to have to learn the shape of her life without him. The first few days were the cruelest because nothing looked different. The sun still rose over the fields and neighbors still waved at the gas station. Megan still went to her shifts at the small hospital, still charted vitals, still smiled politely. But inside her, everything had shifted, like a bone that didn't sit right anymore. At night, she reached for a space in bed that stayed cold. She heard phantom footsteps that never came, and she learned that abandonment doesn't scream, it echoes. Luke texted the way people water plants they already decided not to keep. Short messages, vague updates, hope you're okay, like a checkbox of conscience. Megan replied less and less, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Because every message reopened the wound and called it connection. In the break room at the hospital, she stared at her phone and felt something new. Not longing, clarity. She understood that love cannot survive on crumbs and good intentions. Winter came early that year, rough and honest. A storm knocked power out across the county and the hospital ran on generators. Megan worked a double shift, moving between patients with calm authority. She held an elderly farmer's hand when his breathing turned thin and frightened. She guided a young mother through labor with a steadiness that surprised everyone watching. And somewhere in those fluorescent hallways, she felt herself harden into something truer. Luke had left, but life had demanded her anyway. And she answered. The town noticed her change before she did. People who used to speak to her as Luke's girl started saying her name with respect. Mrs. Harlan from the diner left pie at her doorstep with no questions asked. Pastor Reed offered a quiet prayer after service, without pushing her into a testimony. And Megan, standing among all that small-town kindness, felt a strange mix of pain and gratitude, because she was being held, not by the man who promised, but by the community that stayed, and it reminded her. She was not as alone as Luke's leaving tried to make her believe. Months passed, then a year, and Luke's absence became a season of its own. Megan took a certification course, pushed her career forward, volunteered at community clinics. She fixed the sagging porch step herself, refusing to wait for someone else's hands. She learned to laugh again, softly at first, like her joy needed permission. She learned that healing is not a straight path, it's waking up and choosing yourself anyway. And every time she felt the urge to look back, she remembered the sound of his truck leaving. That sound became a boundary. The day she finally stopped expecting him, the sky was clear and bright. Megan drove past the fields where cornstalks stood tall like quiet witnesses. She pulled into the hospital lot and sat for a moment, breathing in the calm. There was no dramatic moment, no music swelling, just an internal door clicking shut. She whispered almost gently, "I'm done waiting." And it wasn't bitterness, it was freedom. She walked inside like a woman who belonged to her own future. 2 years later, on an autumn afternoon edged with first frost, the diner bell rang. Megan looked up from her coffee and saw a man standing in the doorway. Luke, not the boy who left in a rush of pride, but a man carved down by consequence. His coat was expensive, his watch polished. Success still clung to him like a second skin. But his eyes were different, quieter, heavier, asking permission just to exist in her space. And Megan's heart didn't leap. It steadied as one question rose above all others. Why now? Megan didn't stand up when Luke walked into the diner. She didn't drop her cup, didn't gasp, didn't give him the gift of drama. She simply looked at him the way you look at a memory that tries to become present. Luke hovered by the door like he wasn't sure he deserved warmth or a seat. The bell above him stopped ringing, but the sound stayed in Megan's chest. Outside, the town moved on like nothing had just shifted. Inside, everything in Megan went still, as if her life was waiting to see who he was now. Luke took one step forward, then another, slow as a man walking into a storm. His boots were cleaner than the town's roads, his coat too expensive for this place. But the pride that used to fill his shoulders was gone. His eyes looked like they'd learned what silence costs. He opened his mouth, and for a second, Megan thought she'd hear an apology. Instead, he said her name, soft, careful, like it could shatter between them. "Megan," he breathed, and the way he said it sounded like regret finally found a voice. She nodded once, polite in the way small-town women can be polite while bleeding inside. "Luke," she answered, as if he were a neighbor she hadn't seen in years. Not a man who once held her future like it mattered. The waitress, sensing something sacred and dangerous, pretended to wipe the counter nearby. Luke's hands hovered over the back of a chair but didn't touch it yet. He waited for permission he hadn't earned. Megan noticed that, and it didn't soften her. It steadied her. "Can I sit?" he asked, and the question was smaller than it should have been. It wasn't romantic, wasn't cinematic, wasn't the grand return story people imagine. It was just a man asking for space in the life he abandoned. Megan glanced at the chair, then at him, weighing years in a heartbeat. "Sure," she said, not because she missed him, but because she refused fear control her. Luke sat carefully, like the wood might break under his past. And in the space between them, Megan felt the distance he still didn't understand. The first thing she noticed was what he didn't do. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't try to touch the story back into place. He kept his palms flat on the table, open, visible, honest. "I heard you're running the night shift now," he said, voice tight. Megan's eyes narrowed just slightly, because he had been gone, but not blind. "You heard right," she answered, and took a calm sip of coffee. Luke swallowed, like even her strength made him realize what he'd cost her. Megan's mind didn't show her this moment as it was. It layered it with everything that came before. The porch light, the truck, the cold. It showed her the winter storm she worked through alone. The nights she lay awake, not waiting anymore, just listening to her own breathing. The day she stopped checking her phone and started checking her own heartbeat instead. And now, across from her, sat the man who had once been her home. But Megan had learned how to build shelter without him. Luke cleared his throat, eyes flicking to the window like he needed air. "I'm not here to mess up your life," he said quickly. Megan almost smiled, but it would have been sharp, and she didn't want sharp today. "You already did," she replied, simple and steady. The words landed with no cruelty, just truth. Luke flinched like he'd been expecting anger and got something worse. Clarity. He nodded slowly, as if accepting the weight was the first honest thing he'd done in years. Silence returned, thick as the diner's old wooden beams. In that silence, Megan realized how much she'd changed. 2 years ago, she would have filled the gap with questions, with hope, with pleading. Now she let it sit there, because she didn't fear emptiness anymore. Luke looked down at the table, jaw tight, eyes shining in a way he tried to hide. "I was wrong," he said, voice low, the words scraping out of him. Megan didn't answer, because wrong wasn't the same as responsible. "Why now?" she asked at last, and her tone didn't shake. Luke's throat moved like he was swallowing stones. "I kept telling myself I'd come back when I had something to offer," he admitted. Megan's gaze held him in place, forcing him to keep going. "I thought success would make me feel worthy," he said, almost disgusted with himself. "But I got everything I chased," he whispered, "and it didn't fix what was missing." Megan felt the sting, not because she wanted him, but because she remembered how he left. The waitress set down water without speaking, then walked away fast. Luke stared at the glass like it could give him courage. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," he said, and Megan noticed the restraint. He didn't demand comfort, didn't weaponize tears, didn't try to rewrite the past. "I just needed to look at you and tell you I know what I did," he continued. "I know I left you carrying something I should have carried with you." Megan's fingers tightened around her cup, because that was closer to truth than she expected. Megan had spent 2 years learning to live without closure. She had learned that unanswered questions can become shackles if you let them. So she had cut her own chains with routine, discipline, and purpose. But hearing Luke name the damage out loud cracked something she'd sealed tight. Not because it healed her, because it validated what she survived. Still, she kept her face composed, because she refused to turn pain into performance. "Words are easy," she told him, and the sentence drew a line in the air. Luke nodded again, as if he'd come prepared to be corrected. "I know," he said, and there was no defense in it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Megan's eyes followed it, wary, because gifts can be traps. "It's not money for you," he said quickly, reading her expression. "It's for the hospital," he added, sliding it across the table but not forcing it into her hand. Megan didn't touch it, but her heart noted the difference. He was offering help where it mattered. "You think a donation fixes what you broke?" Megan asked, quiet but piercing. Luke's face tightened, not in anger, but in shame. "No," he admitted. "I think it proves I'm not here to take." Megan studied him, searching for the old Luke, the one who wanted credit and control. This man looked tired in a way success couldn't hide. "I'm staying in town for a while," he said, voice careful. "And I'm going to earn the right to be near the things I used to treat as optional." Megan leaned back slightly as if to remind him she still held the boundary. "You don't get to announce your redemption like it's a plan," she said. Luke flinched again, but he didn't argue. "You're right," he replied. "I don't get to decide how you heal." Megan's eyes softened for half a second, then steadied again, because softness wasn't permission, and she had learned that the hard way. "Good," she said, and the word felt like a gate locking in place. Outside, wind pushed dry leaves along the street like restless thoughts. Luke glanced toward the window and swallowed. "I drive past the old road sometimes," he said, as if confessing a crime. "The one by the field, where we used to talk about forever." Megan's chest tightened, but she didn't let nostalgia lead the conversation. "You left before forever got hard," she reminded him. Luke's eyes lifted, wet now, and he whispered, "That's what I hate most about myself." Megan stood up first because she would not be the woman who waits for him to move. She put cash on the table for her coffee out of habit, out of pride. Luke rose too fast, like panic tried to run him. "Megan," he started, and then stopped, as if he feared doing damage with one more word. She grabbed her coat, steady hands, steady breath. "If you're serious," she said, looking him straight in the face, "then show it without chasing me." Luke nodded once, as if those instructions were a lifeline, not a punishment. Megan walked out into the cold and felt the air burn her lungs clean. She didn't cry in the parking lot, didn't collapse against her car door, but her heartbeat thundered like her body remembered everything at once. Inside the diner, Luke watched her through the window and didn't follow. That restraint was new, and it unsettled her more than pursuit would have. Because restraint suggested growth, and growth made the past harder to hate. Megan sat in her car staring at the steering wheel and whispered, "Lord, don't let me be foolish." That night, at the hospital, Megan moved through hallways lit in pale fluorescent hum. A farmer came in with a deep cut from rusty wire, and Megan stitched with calm precision. In the waiting room, a child clutched a stuffed bear, eyes wide with fear. Megan knelt, spoke softly, and watched the child's shoulders loosen. And as she stood again, she realized something painful and true. Luke had returned to ask for another chance, but her life was no longer a place waiting for him. If redemption was real, it would have to meet her where she was. Standing, built, and unafraid. Spring arrived like permission, slow and stubborn in that small town. The river thawed first, then the fields, then the hearts that had survived winter. Megan drove to the hospital before sunrise, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. She'd learned the language of emergencies, the quiet courage of long nights. Nurses trusted her voice, doctors listened when she spoke, patients calmed when she entered. She wasn't famous, but she was necessary, steady as a lighthouse in rough water. And that steadiness had been forged in the years Luke wasn't there to see it. The town had stopped introducing her as Luke's girl a long time ago. Now they said, "That's Megan," with a respect that didn't require explanation. She organized supply drives when storms hit, coordinated volunteers when farms flooded. She'd built a rotation for home visits to elderly neighbors who couldn't drive anymore. On weekends, she ran a small outreach clinic in the church basement. No spotlight, no applause. Pain had tried to turn her into something smaller, but it failed. It had only sharpened her, into a woman who didn't beg to be valued. Some nights when the hospital halls quieted, memory still tapped on her ribs. Not romance, just echoes. Luke's laugh on a gravel road, his hand in hers at the county fair. She didn't romanticize those moments anymore. She stored them like old photographs. They belonged to who she used to be, and she respected that girl for surviving. Still, there were places she avoided, not from weakness but from wisdom. The old back road by the fields, the overlook where they promised forever too easily. Healing meant choosing peace over reliving what broke her. On a Thursday afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds and sharp wind. It tore through Harlan's property and ripped half the roof off an old barn. By evening, neighbors were already gathering with ladders, nails, and tarps. Megan arrived in scrubs under a jacket, hair pinned up, ready to work. She carried first aid supplies because she'd learned storms always leave injuries behind. And when she stepped into the muddy yard, she saw him. Luke, sleeves rolled up, hands already dirty, lifting beams with quiet focus. He didn't look like a man visiting a past life for entertainment. He looked like a man trying to earn the right to stand on familiar ground. No one announced him, no one treated him like a hero, and he didn't demand it. He spoke to Mr. Harlan with humility, took instructions like he wasn't above sweat. When he noticed Megan, he froze for half a second, then nodded once. Not a greeting that asked for warmth, not a smile that begged for mercy. Just acknowledgement like he understood she didn't owe him comfort. Megan kept working, focused on a teenager with a sliced palm from broken glass. She cleaned the cut, wrapped it gently, and gave instructions with firm calm. Luke stayed at the far end of the barn, hammering, lifting, holding steady. Every so often she felt his presence like weather, there but not invading. She hated that the restraint made her mind wobble, because the Luke she remembered would have needed to be seen, praised, forgiven loudly. This Luke kept showing up like repentance had finally learned silence. The barn roof was secured by midnight, tarps stretched tight against rain. Neighbors clapped one another on the back, laughing in the relief of shared effort. Luke stepped away before anyone could make a speech about him. He loaded tools into his truck like he was just another pair of hands. Megan watched from under the porch light, chest tight with conflicting truths. She didn't miss him, but she couldn't ignore the strange new reality of him. He was here and he wasn't demanding a place. He was building one, plank by plank. Over the next weeks, the town started noticing patterns. A donation of new monitors appeared in the hospital wing, paperwork marked anonymous. The outreach clinic received boxes of supplies, bandages, antibiotics, infant formula. No return address. A local family's heating bill was mysteriously paid after the father got injured in the fields. People whispered about a guardian angel, about a stranger with money and a conscience. Megan tried not to think of Luke, but her instincts kept circling the same name. Because the help wasn't flashy, it was precise, intentional, and deeply practical. One evening, Megan found an older nurse staring at a clipboard near the storage room. "Look at this," the nurse murmured, voice hushed like they were in church. Megan stepped closer and saw the invoice. Equipment funded by a private foundation. The name printed at the top didn't scream Luke, but it whispered him. A company he'd once talked about back when someday sounded romantic instead of risky. Megan's stomach tightened, and she handed the clipboard back without a word. If it was him, he'd been helping long before the diner, meaning this wasn't a whim. Megan told herself it didn't matter who paid. The hospital needed the help. The town needed the help. That was the point. But at night, alone in her kitchen, her mind betrayed her with questions. Why now, in this specific way, so careful it almost looked like reverence? Was it guilt trying to dress itself up as generosity? Or had Luke finally learned that love speaks best through sacrifice and consistency? Megan hated that she couldn't answer, and hated even more that she wanted to. Then the call came that changed her breathing. Hospital billing asked her to confirm a payment on a patient's account. Megan assumed it was an error until the woman said the name. Ruth, her mother. Megan's fingers went cold around the phone as she heard the amount. Paid in full. Her mother's procedure had been expensive, a weight Megan carried quietly for months, and now someone had lifted it without asking to be thanked. Megan drove to her mother's house that night with the sky bruised purple. Ruth opened the door in a soft cardigan, eyes gentle, like she already knew the storm inside Megan. "I didn't want to tell you over the phone," Ruth said, stepping aside. Megan walked in and saw the receipt on the table, neatly folded like a confession. "There was a note," Ruth added, voice careful. But it wasn't signed. Megan unfolded the paper with hands that shook despite her discipline. 3 simple words stared up at her. "Let her breathe." Megan's throat tightened so hard it hurt. She didn't cry, but her eyes burned with the violence of restraint. "Mom, who did this?" she asked, already knowing what she didn't want confirmed. Ruth hesitated, then sat down slowly like the truth had weight. "Luke came by," Ruth admitted. "Not to make a scene, just to speak." Megan's pulse thundered, anger rising fast, protective and sharp. "He had no right," Megan whispered because her mother was sacred ground. Ruth lifted a hand, calm but firm, the way mothers command storms to settle. "He didn't ask for anything," she said. "He didn't even tell me he paid at first." Megan's jaw clenched, emotions colliding in her chest like cars in fog. "He apologized to me," Ruth continued, "for leaving you with the burden of being strong alone." Megan looked away, staring at the window where the dark pressed against glass. Ruth's voice softened. "He cried, Megan. Not for himself, because he finally understood what he did." The words made Megan angry and sad at the same time, and she hated that combination. "He can't buy forgiveness," Megan said, voice low and dangerous. Ruth nodded as if she'd expected that exact sentence. "He didn't try to," she replied. "He told me you don't owe him kindness. You don't owe him time." Megan's breath caught because that sounded like a man who'd stopped negotiating love. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed Megan's fingers. He said he's staying, Ruth added, watching her daughter carefully. He said he turned down a promotion to come back here because he's done running from Roots. Megan stood up abruptly, chair scraping the floor. The room felt smaller, like the walls were listening. She paced once, then stopped, palms pressed to the counter to steady herself. If Luke had truly chosen this town again, it meant he was choosing discomfort on purpose. It meant his success wasn't a trophy he carried away. It was a tool he brought back. Megan hated how much that mattered to her heart, even against her will. Because it suggested this wasn't a return for romance. It was a return for repair. The next morning, Megan walked into the hospital and found Luke in the hallway. Not near her unit, near pediatrics, speaking softly to a tired father in worn boots. Luke held a clipboard, not like a boss, but like a volunteer trying not to mess up. When the father walked away, shoulders lighter, Luke turned and saw Megan. He didn't smile. He didn't rush toward her. He simply waited, eyes honest, hands empty. Megan stepped closer, voice steady but sharp. "You paid for my mother's care." Luke swallowed, and the guilt in his face looked like something he'd stopped hiding from. "I did," he admitted quietly, as if volume would make it uglier. Megan's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to purchase peace in my life." Luke nodded once, accepting the blow without defense. "I didn't do it to buy you," he said, voice rough. "I did it because you shouldn't have carried that alone." Megan's throat tightened, fury and gratitude fighting for the same space. Luke's eyes held hers like a vow. "You can hate me and still let me do what's right." And Megan realized, with a sudden chill, that Chapter 4 wouldn't be about his return. It would be about whether she could face him without losing herself. Megan didn't lower her voice when she faced Luke in the hospital hallway. The fluorescent lights made everything look too honest, too exposed. "You crossed a line," she said, steady as a scalpel in trained hands. Luke didn't flinch away from the blade of her words. He just nodded, eyes tired, jaw tight, like he'd rehearsed owning it. "I know," he answered, and the simplicity felt like a confession. Megan hated that it didn't sound like an excuse. She stepped closer, not to intimidate him, just to make sure he heard her. "My mother is not your altar," she said, each word careful and sharp. Luke's throat moved like he was swallowing shame on purpose. "I didn't go to her to reach you," he said quietly. Megan's eyes narrowed because she'd been lied to with softer voices before. "I went because I saw what you were carrying," Luke added, "and I couldn't unsee it." The truth in his tone unsettled her more than a pretty apology ever could. Megan's hands clenched once, then relaxed. Control always returned to her. "You don't get to decide what I should have had," she said. Luke nodded again, accepting correction like a man who'd learned humility the hard way. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't get to decide anything about your healing." His gaze held hers without demanding softness, and that restraint burned her nerves. She'd expected him to plead, to charm, to push the story toward romance. Instead, he stood there like punishment was part of repentance. Megan's pager beeped, pulling her back into the life she built. She turned as if to walk away, but her voice stopped him one more time. "If you're doing this for your guilt," she said over her shoulder, "stop." Luke's answer came fast, and it was quiet enough to feel real. "I'm doing it because I finally understand," he said. Megan paused, heart thundering, because understanding was the one thing she'd begged for in silence. Then she walked away anyway, refusing to let old hope drive her feet. That evening, the sky turned the color of bruised peaches over the fields. Megan drove the back road she used to avoid, not out of longing, out of bravery. She told herself she was taking the longer route home to clear her head. But she knew the truth. She was testing whether the past still owned her. Wind moved through the corn like a whispering crowd, and at the old overlook, she saw Luke's truck parked near the fence line. He was leaning against it, staring into the distance like he deserved the view less than anyone. Megan stopped a few feet away and didn't pretend surprise. Luke turned slowly, shoulders tense, then softened when he saw it was her. "I didn't follow you," he said immediately, almost like he was afraid she'd think he tracked her. "I know," Megan replied, because she'd noticed the difference. He wasn't hunting her anymore. He didn't step closer until she did. The space between them felt like 2 years of winter packed into one breath. And Megan realized she'd come here to say what she never allowed herself to say before. "Do you know what it did to me?" she asked, voice low, controlled. Luke's eyes darkened with pain and he nodded like he'd been waiting for the question. "I think I'm starting to," he whispered. Megan let out a short laugh that wasn't humor, just disbelief. "You left me with the worst kind of silence," she said. "Not the quiet of peace. The quiet of being discarded without explanation." Luke closed his eyes for a second, like the words hit where they were meant to. Megan's voice didn't crack, but it carried weight like iron in velvet. "I had to become my own closure," she continued. "I had to learn how to breathe without waiting for your footsteps." Luke's hands tightened around the edge of the truck bed. "I know," he said, voice rough, and his throat sounded raw with regret. Megan stared at him, forcing him to stay present. "And you don't get to come back and ask for the version of me you abandoned," she finished. Luke opened his eyes, and there was no defense in them, only surrender. "I'm not asking for that version," he said. Megan blinked, thrown off by the sentence she expected to fight. "I'm asking for a chance to earn the right to know the woman you became," Luke added. The wind shoved against them, cold and insistent. Megan's heart clenched, not from romance. Jack recognition that he wasn't trying to rewrite her growth. That made everything harder, because it meant she couldn't dismiss him as the same old Luke. "Why did you leave?" Megan asked. The question finally allowed to breathe. Luke's jaw trembled once and he looked away toward the fields. "Because I was terrified," he admitted. "Terrified that if I stayed, you'd see how small I felt inside." Megan's eyes narrowed, not softened. Fear didn't excuse damage. "I thought success would make me safe," he continued, voice heavy. "But I learned something ugly. You can win everything and still be hollow enough to ruin love." Megan stepped closer until she was within arm's reach, then stopped. "You didn't just leave a town," she said. "You left responsibility." Luke nodded, eyes glossy now, and he didn't wipe them away. "I did," he said. "And I hate that I did." Megan's chest rose slow, deliberate, keeping emotion from spilling into surrender. "Words don't rebuild trust," she reminded him, because she needed him to hear the rule. Luke's answer came like a vow laid carefully on the ground. "Then I'll rebuild it with time," Luke said. "With consistency, even when it's uncomfortable. With actions that don't ask you to clap." Megan stared at him, searching for the hidden hook, the manipulation. She found none. Only a man willing to be judged. "You can walk away from me forever," he added, voice breaking slightly. "And I'll still do what's right here." That last part hit Megan hardest. He wasn't just asking for her, he was choosing the town again. Megan's eyes flicked to his truck, then back to his face. "Choosing the town is easy when you're successful," she said, testing him. Luke shook his head once, bitter at himself. "I turned down the promotion," he said. Megan froze because that was not the story she expected from a man like him. "It would have taken me overseas for years," Luke explained. "And I finally understood I don't get to chase more while leaving damage behind me again." Megan's throat tightened as old memories tried to wake up. She remembered Luke's hunger, his restlessness, his constant looking beyond the horizon. "You're telling me you stayed for this?" she asked, almost angry at the vulnerability. Luke's gaze didn't flinch. "I stayed for repair," he said. Then, softer, "And because I realized my life means nothing if I'm the kind of man who runs." Megan felt the sting behind her eyes, and hated it, because tears still felt like giving him access. She turned away, looking at the fields that had watched them promise forever. "I can't forgive you just because you finally grew up," she said. Luke stepped back half a pace, giving her space like he respected the boundary. "I'm not asking you to," he replied. Megan swallowed, grounding herself in the chill air. "Then stop circling my life," she added, voice firm. "Stop trying to be close to me." Luke's answer was quiet, devastating, and honest. "I will," he said. Megan turned sharply, startled. He lifted his hand slightly, palms open, not dramatic, just sincere. "I'll stop pursuing you," he continued, "because you told me to." Her heart stumbled, confused by obedience that didn't come with resentment. "But I won't stop showing up for what matters." Luke added. "And I won't stop being accountable even if you never speak to me again." Megan didn't know what to do with that kind of surrender. It didn't feel like power. It felt like responsibility. And that was frightening. She nodded once because it was all she trusted herself to give. Then she walked back to her car, hands steady, legs strong. Luke didn't follow. He didn't call her name. He stayed at the fence line like a man practicing restraint as worship. And Megan drove away with her heart racing, not from love. Check the terrifying possibility of change. When Megan pulled into her mother's driveway, the porch light was already on. She stepped out expecting quiet, expecting her safe routine. Instead, she saw movement near the small guest house behind Ruth's home. Luke walked out carrying grocery bags, keys hanging from his fingers like proof. He froze when he saw Megan, guilt flashing across his face. Then he lowered his gaze. Ruth opened the front door and said gently, "I let him rent it, because he needed somewhere to start over." And Megan realized the return wasn't a visit anymore. Luke had become her neighbor. Megan didn't sleep much that night, not because she missed Luke, but because her world had shifted sideways. The guest house behind her mother's home wasn't just a building. It was proof that Luke wasn't treating this like a sentimental stop. He had planted himself in the soil of the life he abandoned. And Megan hated how that felt like pressure, even if he never spoke it aloud. Because distance had been her safety, and now distance was gone. The next morning, Megan arrived at the hospital early, as always. She moved through her routine like armor, charts, meds, vitals, calm voice. But her mind kept slipping toward the image of Luke carrying groceries like a penance. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Anyone could play humble for a week. Men were good at grand gestures when guilt needed somewhere to go. Megan had seen it. Apologies that lasted until the first inconvenience. So she made a decision. She would watch patterns, not moments. Luke didn't show up at the hospital to talk. He didn't request a meeting, didn't ask the staff to tell Megan he was there. Instead, he met with the administrator quietly, paperwork in hand. A new community partnership was being drafted, funding for rural patient transport, a program that would keep farmers from choosing between medical care and lost work hours. Megan overheard his name once, then twice, and still he didn't look for her. It was the first time his presence didn't feel like an invasion. Days passed, and Luke became visible in the least dramatic places. At the diner, he tipped too much and listened more than he spoke. At the hardware store, he carried lumber for an older man without being asked. At the church, he sat in the back pew, head down, leaving before anyone could corner him. He didn't try to win the town with a speech, he just served it. Megan watched from a distance and stayed cautious, because redemption should be tested. But she couldn't deny something uncomfortable. He looked like a man who finally understood gravity. The first real test came on a Friday night in the ER. A teenager arrived after a dirt bike accident, blood on his shirt, father shaking with fear. Megan took over with the precision she'd earned through hard years. The boy needed imaging fast, but the scanner was delayed. Power issues again. Voices rose, tempers flared, stress turning people sharp. Then Luke appeared in the hallway, not panicked, not loud, just present. He spoke to the technician, made 2 calls, and the generator issue was handled in minutes. Megan cornered him near the supply closet when the crisis settled. "Are you trying to be a hero?" she asked, blunt as a blade. Luke didn't smile, didn't posture. "No," he said. "I'm trying to be useful." Megan's eyes narrowed. "Useful for who?" Luke met her gaze. "For the people I abandoned when I left." His answer didn't flatter her. It convicted him, and she felt her anger hesitate, confused. She expected him to follow that moment with a request, a coffee, a conversation, a chance. But Luke simply stepped back, as if he knew closeness had to be offered, not taken. He returned to the hallway, spoke to the father again, then left. Megan stood there, irritated at how cleanly he respected boundaries, because it robbed her of the easy argument that he was selfish. It forced her to face a harder possibility. He might actually be changing. And Megan had never learned how to negotiate with a transformed version of her wound. That weekend, Ruth invited Megan for lunch like she always did. Her mother's kitchen smelled like rosemary and warm bread, comfort wrapped in steam. Megan tried to keep the conversation normal. Weather, work, the coming harvest festival. Then Ruth said carefully, "Luke asked me something yesterday." Megan's body tensed before her mind agreed to listen. "What?" she asked, voice even. Ruth's eyes softened. "He asked what you needed back then, when he left." Megan stared at the table, jaw tight. "He doesn't get to ask that now," she said. Ruth nodded gently. "He knows." Then, quieter. "But he wanted to understand the exact place he failed you." Megan felt heat rise in her chest. Anger, grief, something sharp and old. "I needed him to stay," Megan whispered, voice betraying her before she could stop it. Ruth reached for her hand. "And you stayed anyway," she said, proud and tender. That sentence made Megan's eyes burn, because it honored her without romanticizing the pain. The harvest festival arrived with string lights and crisp air. Kids ran between booths, laughing with sticky fingers and apple cider smiles. Megan volunteered at the first aid tent as usual, checking scraped knees and handing out bandages. She felt steady there, useful, grounded, in control. Then she saw Luke across the square, helping an elderly woman carry a box of pies. He was wearing a plain flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, hands busy. No spotlight, no performance, just service, like he was trying to speak apology in a language that couldn't be faked. Later, a sudden commotion broke out near the stage. A small boy climbed onto a railing, slipped and fell hard. Megan sprinted instantly, heart focused, mind sharp. The boy's mother screamed. People crowded, panic spreading like fire. Luke pushed through without shoving, creating space with a calm authority. He didn't touch the boy until Megan assessed. He just held the crowd back, steadying the air. When Megan asked for supplies, Luke ran and returned fast, breath visible in the cold. He didn't ask if she needed him. He simply did what needed doing. After the boy was stable, Megan stepped aside and exhaled. Luke stood a few feet away, hands on his hips, eyes watching her with quiet respect. "You were good," he said softly. Megan didn't accept praise easily. It always sounded like manipulation when it came from him. "Don't," she warned, voice low. Luke nodded. "Okay." Then he said, even softer, "I'm sorry you had to become this strong alone." The sentence landed differently than an apology for leaving, because it acknowledged the cost, not just the act. Megan's throat tightened, and she hated that it did. She turned her face slightly so he couldn't read too much. "You're saying the right things now," she said. Luke didn't argue. "I'm trying to say the true things." Megan's eyes flicked back to his. "Truth doesn't undo damage." "I know," he replied, voice rough. "But it's where repair starts." For a second, the space between them felt less like war and more like a bridge being measured. Megan swallowed and stepped back, because bridges still terrified her. Not because she didn't want connection, but because she refused to fall again. The next week, Megan found a folder on her desk at the hospital. Inside were plans for a new mobile clinic route, rural stops, staffing rotations, supply lists. At the bottom, a note in simple handwriting read, "Tell me what's wrong with this plan. I'll fix it." No signature, but she recognized Luke's careful, restrained tone. He wasn't offering romance, he was offering partnership in something larger than them. Megan stared at the pages for a long time, feeling the weight of choice. She could ignore it and protect her heart, or she could engage and test whether his actions could survive accountability. That night, Megan drove to the guest house behind Ruth's home. She didn't plan a speech, she planned clarity. Luke opened the door quickly, as if he'd sensed her car before she even knocked. He didn't smile like he'd won. He looked nervous, almost boyish. Megan held up the folder. "This," she said. "It's incomplete." Luke nodded immediately. "Tell me." Megan stepped inside without invitation because she refused to be timid in her own story. And Luke moved aside like making room was the only power he deserved. Megan spread the plans on the small table, pointing to the flaws without softness. "These stops are too far apart," she said. "You'll lose patience between routes." Luke leaned in, listening like a student instead of a savior. The staffing schedule is unrealistic, Megan continued. Burnout will kill the program. Luke nodded, writing notes fast. And you didn't include maternity resources, Megan added, eyes sharp. This town needs that. Luke looked up, shame flickering. You're right, he said. I missed it. Megan watched him accept correction, and it did something dangerous inside her. It built trust grain by grain. When she finished, Luke set the pen down slowly. I'm glad you came, he said, voice gentle, careful not to push. Megan's eyes narrowed. Don't misunderstand, she warned. This isn't forgiveness. Luke nodded. I know. Megan held his gaze, testing for the old hunger to rush, to claim. Instead, Luke said the one sentence she didn't expect. You don't have to give me your heart, he whispered. Just don't let my past steal your peace. Megan's chest tightened, because that sounded like love without entitlement. Megan left the guest house with the folder no longer feeling like a weapon. The air outside was cold and clean, stars sharp over the fields. She walked toward her car and realized her hands weren't shaking. Luke hadn't tried to touch her, hadn't asked for a date, hadn't demanded emotion. He had asked for feedback, for accountability, for a chance to do right work. And Megan hated how much she respected that, because respect was the first brick in any bridge. And if she wasn't careful, respect could become hope. The first time Megan allowed Luke to sit with her outside of a crisis, it wasn't romantic. It was late evening at the hospital, the parking lot nearly empty, air crisp with coming winter. Megan stood near her car, keys in hand, shoulders tight from a long shift. Luke approached slowly from the far side of the lot like he was careful with distance. He didn't smile like he was entitled to her mood. He just stopped a few feet away and said, If you want, I can walk you to your car. Megan's eyes flicked to him, measuring. Then she nodded once. Permission, not invitation. They walked in silence for a while, the kind that used to feel like punishment. Now Megan let it be what it was. Space to see if he could stay without filling it. Luke's hands were in his pockets, posture relaxed but restrained. He didn't make jokes, didn't try to lighten what was heavy. The wind pushed leaves along the pavement, scraping like quiet confession. Megan's heartbeat stayed steady, but her mind kept scanning for danger. Because the last time she trusted Luke's presence, it turned into absence. You're not doing this for me, Megan said suddenly, voice calm but direct. Luke looked at her, not startled, almost relieved she said it. No, he admitted. I'm doing it because it's right. Megan nodded slowly, eyes forward. Good. Because if it's for me, it won't last. Luke swallowed, and his voice roughened. I know. That sentence hit Megan in a strange way. Like he finally understood that love isn't a performance. It's endurance. And endurance is tested when nobody claps. They reached her car and Megan stopped, fingers tight on the keys. She turned to him, gaze sharp. I need you to understand something. Luke nodded, waiting. Megan's voice lowered. You don't get to come back and become a chapter I'm forced to reread. Luke's eyes softened with pain, but he didn't argue. I won't, he promised quietly. Megan studied him. Don't promise. Prove. Luke nodded once, accepting that proof was the only currency left. The next week, the mobile clinic plan moved forward. Luke was at the meetings, but he didn't lead like a man trying to reclaim authority. He asked questions, took notes, adjusted budgets, listened when Megan spoke. When doctors challenged the feasibility, Luke didn't sell them a dream. He added solutions. When volunteers hesitated, he filled the gaps himself without announcing it. Megan watched him work and felt the conflict inside her grow sharper. Because he was competent, present, steady, and that was exactly the kind of man she once believed he could be. One evening, after a planning session ran long, Megan found herself alone with him. They stood in the hospital corridor near a window, streetlights pooling gold outside. Luke's gaze rested on the glass like he was bracing for something. Megan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, posture protective. You've been consistent, she said, not praise, just observation. Luke nodded, eyes still on the window. I'm trying. Megan exhaled slowly. Then we need to talk about the part you keep circling. Luke turned toward her, face tightening. He knew what she meant. Megan's voice didn't shake, but it carried weight like a door closing softly. "Tell me the real reason you left," she said. Luke's jaw worked, and for a second he looked like he might retreat into silence. But he didn't. He stayed. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," he said quietly. "I left because I didn't know how to be enough." Megan's eyes narrowed, not softened. "Enough for who?" she asked, cutting to the root. Luke's throat bobbed. "For the life we were building," he admitted. "For being a husband someday. A father. A man who doesn't disappoint." Megan's mouth tightened. "So you ran?" Luke nodded, shame flickering. "Yes." Megan felt anger rise. Not loud, not explosive, but sharp and hot. Because fear was human, but abandonment was a choice. "You let me think I wasn't worth staying for," Megan said, voice low. Luke's face crumpled for a second before he forced it steady. "I know," he whispered. Megan stepped closer, eyes bright with controlled pain. "You understand what that does to a woman?" she asked. Luke swallowed hard. "It teaches her to stop needing anyone," he said, and the truth in it sounded like grief. Megan's throat tightened, because he wasn't wrong, and she hated that the cost of her strength had a name. Him. Luke lifted his gaze, eyes wet, and didn't hide it. "I was proud of you from a distance," he said, voice breaking. Megan's face hardened. "Don't." Luke nodded quickly. "I'm not saying it to claim anything, I'm saying it because it's true." He inhaled, shaky. "I watched your life through scraps. People talking, small news, photos online." Megan's stomach turned. "So you were there, but not there." Luke winced like she slapped him with words. "Yes," he whispered. "And it was cowardly." Megan turned away, staring down the hall as if the walls could keep her steady. Her hands trembled once, then stilled. "I cried alone for months," she said quietly, confession ripping out of her like it was overdue. "I didn't tell anyone how bad it got. I went to work, I smiled, I functioned." Luke's breath caught, and the sound was broken. "I thought I was dying inside," Megan continued, voice thin but controlled. "And you were out there finding yourself, while I was learning how to survive without a reason." The silence after that felt holy and brutal. Luke didn't rush to defend himself. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," like a bandage. He stood there, eyes fixed on her back, and let her words stay sharp. Then, quietly, he said, "Tell me everything." Megan turned, startled, because most men ask for mercy when confronted with pain. Luke asked for truth, even if it cut him. Megan's eyes burned. "You think you can handle it?" she asked. Luke nodded once. "I have to," he said. "Because you did." Megan took a slow breath, grounding herself. She told him about the nights she fell asleep with the phone in her hand and woke up ashamed. She told him about the bills, the fear, her mother's health scares she hid so she wouldn't sound desperate. She told him about the way the town looked at her sometimes, pity disguised as politeness. She told him the worst part wasn't him leaving. The worst part was him leaving like she was strong enough to deserve abandonment. Luke's face tightened, tears falling now, quiet and unglamorous. And he didn't wipe them away, as if he'd finally learned he didn't deserve to look composed. "I don't know how to make that right," Luke whispered. Megan's answer came immediate. "You can't." Luke flinched, but he didn't run. Megan stepped closer, eyes fierce. "You can only live like you understand it." Luke nodded, breathing hard like staying still was the hardest workout of his life. "I will," he said, voice rough. "Even if it takes years." Megan's heart clenched, because years was the only time frame that sounded honest. And honesty, real honesty, was dangerous because it felt like the beginning of hope. A call light flashed down the hall, another patient, another need. Megan instinctively started forward, but Luke's voice stopped her softly. "Megan," he said, and the way he said it held reverence, not ownership. She turned. Luke's eyes were red but steady. "You don't owe me a second chance," he whispered. Megan's throat tightened. "But if you ever choose to let me close," he continued, "I won't run when it gets hard again." Megan stared at him, chest tight. because that was the exact promise she once begged for, and now, hearing it, she didn't know whether to believe it or fear it. Megan's voice dropped to a whisper. "Prove it." Luke nodded like he expected nothing less. Then, without drama, he stepped back and said, "Go help your patient." Megan hesitated, thrown off by the lack of demand. Luke didn't chase the moment. He released it. She walked away, heart pounding, and looked back once. Luke was still there, still standing in the same place like he was practicing staying. And that image stayed with her all night. 2 hours later, Megan stepped out of a patient's room exhausted. She expected the hallway to be empty. Instead, Luke was sitting on a bench near the vending machines, head bowed, waiting quietly. Not because he needed something, because he refused to leave while her world was heavy. Megan stopped, surprised despite herself. Luke lifted his head. "I told you I wouldn't run," he said softly. Megan's eyes burned, because it wasn't romantic. It was respectful. And respect was the one thing that could rebuild trust without stealing her dignity. Megan walked closer, then stopped a few feet away, still cautious. Luke stood slowly, hands at his sides, giving her space. Megan's voice was quiet but firm. "If you want to stay in this town, stay." Luke nodded, breath caught. "But if you ever leave again," Megan continued, eyes sharp, "you don't get to come back looking for me." Luke's face tightened, and he nodded like he was accepting a sentence. "I understand," he whispered. "This time, staying is the point." And for the first time in 2 years, Megan felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not love, but the beginning of a door unlocking. Forgiveness didn't arrive like a sunrise. It came like morning fog, slow, cautious, unsure if it would lift. Megan kept her routines intact because routine had saved her. She didn't rearrange her life to make space for Luke's return. If he was going to be part of her world again, he would have to enter it carefully. Luke seemed to understand that. He stayed on the edges unless invited closer. And for the first time, Megan saw a man learning to love without control. The mobile clinic launched on a crisp Saturday, sky clear as a promise. A white van rolled into the church parking lot, stocked with supplies and quiet hope. Farm families arrived early, hats in hand, children sleepy against their shoulders. Megan led the team with firm warmth, her voice steady, her eyes attentive. Luke helped in the background, loading boxes, checking fuel, handing out water. He wore no badge, no title, nothing that announced his success. He looked like a man trying to be invisible so the work could be seen. A reporter from a nearby county showed up with a camera and a hungry smile. Small towns loved a story, especially one that looked like redemption. She asked about the funding, about the man who returned, about the woman who stayed. Megan's jaw tightened because she refused to become a headline. Luke stepped forward before Megan could speak, calm and direct. "This clinic isn't about me," he said. "Please focus on the staff and the families." The reporter blinked, surprised by a man refusing attention. Megan felt something shift, because he was protecting her without claiming her. Still, the town's eyes were everywhere. People watched Megan and Luke the way they watched weather, anticipating damage. Some neighbors wanted romance, others wanted punishment. Megan refused both. She held her boundaries like a quiet law. No public performances, no borrowed narratives. Luke respected that rule like it was sacred. When people teased him about winning her back, Luke only said, "I'm not owed anything." And that sentence, said plainly, softened even the hardest skeptics. Then, on a windy afternoon, the test came from the one place Megan couldn't ignore. A farmer's wife collapsed at the clinic stop, blood pressure dangerously high. The nearest hospital was 30 minutes away, roads rough from recent rain. Megan moved instantly, calling ahead, stabilizing the woman, assigning tasks. Luke was already at the van, engine running, phone in hand coordinating a clear route. The husband's hands shook as he climbed in, eyes wild with fear. Luke placed a steady hand on his shoulder, voice low. "We're not losing her. Not today." Megan heard it and felt the weight of his presence, calm where chaos used to live. At the hospital, the woman was rushed into care. The husband paced the hallway like his feet were prayers. Megan stood beside him, explaining what the doctors were doing, translating fear into facts. Luke stayed close, silent, not intruding, just anchoring the air. When the husband's knees buckled, Luke caught him before he hit the floor. No cameras, no applause, no dramatic speeches. Just a man doing what Megan once needed, staying when it was hard. Hours later, when the crisis passed, Megan stepped outside for air. The sky was bruised gray, wind sharp against her cheeks. Luke followed at a distance, then stopped beside the hospital wall. He didn't speak right away. Megan's hands trembled from adrenaline, and she hated how vulnerable it made her feel. Luke finally said, "You carried things like that alone for 2 years." Megan swallowed. "Yes," she answered, voice thin. Luke's gaze lowered. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Not as a shortcut, but as grief. Megan didn't give him forgiveness in that moment. But she didn't shut him out either. She let silence settle between them like a blanket instead of a weapon. Luke's breath came slow, controlled, like he was holding himself in place. Megan looked at him and saw the difference. He wasn't trying to be the hero. He was trying to be dependable. And dependability was the only thing strong enough to rebuild trust. Megan exhaled and said quietly, "You did good today." Luke's eyes lifted, startled, like the words were water in a desert. He didn't smile wide. He didn't celebrate. He just nodded once, reverent, and said, "Thank you." Megan's chest tightened, because that simple exchange felt more intimate than a kiss. It was permission, tiny, careful, earned. Luke didn't reach for more. He stayed inside the space she offered and didn't push a toe beyond it. And Megan realized that trust wasn't being demanded. It was being invited. The days that followed were quieter, softer at the edges. Luke kept showing up. Early mornings, late nights, always steady. He fixed a broken step at Ruth's house without being asked. He restocked the clinic van, replaced worn tires, checked medical supply levels. Megan watched him do it, not with romantic eyes, but with a strategist's mind. Consistency was data, and Luke was building a record that couldn't be denied. Still, Megan's heart remained cautious because records don't erase old wounds. They only prove new patterns. One evening, Ruth invited them both for dinner. Megan almost refused out of instinct, but something inside her nudged forward. Not longing, curiosity. Ruth's dining room glowed warm, candles flickering, the scent of roast and herbs filling the air. Luke arrived early and helped set the table, sleeves rolled up like a man at home. When Megan walked in, Luke looked up and paused as if her presence still startled him with gratitude. He didn't call her beautiful. He simply said, "Hi," like he was honored she came at all. Megan sat down and felt the strange ache of normalcy. Conversation stayed safe at first. Clinic schedules, weather, harvest plans. Then Ruth excused herself to check dessert, leaving Megan and Luke alone with soft candlelight. The silence between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was delicate. Luke's fingers traced the edge of his water glass once, nervous. Megan studied him. "You're uncomfortable," she observed. Luke gave a short, honest exhale. "I'm terrified," he admitted. Megan's brow lifted slightly. Of what? Luke's eyes held hers. Of losing the chance to do this right. That answer wasn't romantic. It was responsibility spoken out loud. Megan's throat tightened and she looked down at her plate. "You already lost me once," she said quietly. Luke nodded and pain crossed his face. "I know." He leaned forward just slightly, careful not to invade. "I don't want you to forgive me fast," he said, voice low. Megan looked up, surprised. Luke continued, "I want you to be safe, even if that safety takes years." The sincerity in that sentence made Megan's eyes burn, because it honored her boundaries instead of battling them. Ruth returned with pie, saving Megan from the storm inside her chest. Dinner finished gently, without drama, without forced closeness. When Megan stood to leave, Luke followed her out to the porch. The night air was cold, stars sharp above the dark fields. They stood side by side, not touching, like two people learning a new language. Luke cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming," he said. Megan nodded. "I did it for my mother," she replied, but her voice softened on the last word. Luke smiled faintly, accepting whatever truth she could offer. As Megan walked to her car, her keys jingled like nervous music. Luke stayed on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching without chasing. Megan opened the car door, then paused, heart beating hard. She turned back, surprised by her own movement. Luke froze, as if he didn't want to assume anything. Megan's voice was steady but quieter than usual. "Do you ever regret leaving every single day?" Luke's face tightened and his eyes shone. "Yes," he whispered. "But regret isn't enough. That's why I'm here." The honesty hit Megan like wind to an open wound. She swallowed, fighting the instinct to retreat. Luke stepped down from the porch slowly, stopping a few feet away. "I don't deserve to be close to you," he said, voice rough. Megan's jaw tightened. "Then don't try," she replied, testing him one more time. Luke nodded. "Okay," he said simply. Then softer, "But if you ever want closeness, I'll be patient." Megan stared at him, heart pounding, because patience used to be something Luke didn't have. A gust of wind swept through the yard, rattling the porch swing. Megan hugged her coat tighter, and Luke noticed. Without asking, he took off his scarf and held it out, not placing it on her, not touching her, just offering warmth with respect. Megan hesitated, then took it, fingers brushing the fabric. Not his hand. Luke's breath hitched like that small acceptance meant more than any kiss. Megan wrapped the scarf around her neck and felt something soften in her chest. Not surrender, something braver, the willingness to feel again. Megan opened her car door, then looked back one last time. Luke stood in the cold, hands empty now, watching her like she was something precious he didn't own. Megan's voice came out low, almost reluctant. "Tomorrow. Meet me at the clinic van at 6. Luke's eyes widened, a flicker of hope he tried to hide. "Yes," he said immediately, then steadied himself. "I'll be there." Megan nodded once, climbed into her car, and started the engine. As she drove away, the scarf warm on her skin, Megan realized something terrifying and true. Trust was returning, not like a flood, but like a heartbeat she thought she'd lost. 6 a.m. in that small town looked like soft gold spilling over fields. The air was sharp, clean, the kind that wakes your lungs and your courage. Megan arrived at the clinic van before the sun fully lifted, coffee steaming in her hand. She stood by the driver's door, watching fog drift low across the road like a quiet warning. This wasn't a date. This was a decision point, one that would shape the rest of her life. Because letting Luke close again would require a bravery different from surviving without him. Luke pulled in at exactly 6, like he was afraid lateness would prove the old him was still alive. He stepped out wearing a simple coat, hands empty, eyes steady. No flowers, no charm, no forced smile. Just a man showing up the way he promised he would. "Morning," he said softly. Megan nodded, her voice calm. "Morning." Then she handed him a clipboard like it was a test and a trust at the same time. The day was long, farm roads, dusty stops, families waiting with quiet hope. Megan worked the way she always did, steady hands, gentle voice, eyes that saw more than symptoms. Luke did everything else, loading supplies, checking tires, refilling water bottles, keeping the route on track. He didn't try to impress her. He tried to relieve her. At one stop, an older woman thanked him, mistaking him for the driver. Luke just smiled and said, "I'm just helping," like humility finally fit him. Around noon, the sky darkened unexpectedly, storm clouds rolling in like old memories. Rain hit hard, turning dirt roads to slick ribbons. A call came through. A farmer down the road had collapsed in a field, possible heart issue. Megan's body went into instinct, sharp and fast. Luke started the van without being told, eyes focused, hands steady on the wheel. They drove through rain like a race against time, wipers slapping back fear. And Megan realized something in that moment. Luke didn't panic. He stayed present. They reached the field, boots sinking into mud, wind tearing at their coats. The man lay on the ground, face pale, breath shallow, wife crying beside him. Megan knelt instantly, checking pulse, giving instructions, calm as steel wrapped in kindness. Luke held the wife's shoulders, steadying her without stealing the moment. When Megan needed supplies, Luke had them in her hand before she asked. When the ambulance delay was announced, Luke made calls. Fast, precise, controlled. He didn't try to lead Megan. He supported her like he understood her strength is not a place to compete. The ambulance arrived, the man stabilized, the wife's tears easing into trembling relief. Megan stood in the rain for a second too long, letting adrenaline drain. Luke stepped beside her, not touching, just close enough to share the weather. "You were incredible," he said quietly. Megan didn't flinch this time. "Thank you," she answered. 2 words that used to feel impossible. Luke exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years, and Megan felt it. The bridge wasn't finished, but it was real. They drove back to town in silence, rain tapping the roof like soft applause. Megan stared out the window, watching fields blur into gray. Her heart was heavy, not with pain but with choice. Survival had been simple in one way. It didn't require trust. Love did. Love required risk, and Megan had sworn never to risk herself for someone who could walk away. Yet Luke's hands on the steering wheel looked steady, like a man who'd finally learned what leaving costs. That night, Megan sat on her porch with her mother, watching the storm clear. The air smelled like wet earth and new beginnings. Ruth rocked slowly in the old chair, blanket over her knees, eyes gentle. "You're thinking hard," Ruth said, not accusing, just observing. Megan nodded once. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly. Ruth reached over and squeezed her hand. "Being afraid means it matters," she said. Megan swallowed. "I don't want to be foolish." Ruth's voice softened. "Then don't be. Be wise and brave." The next day, Megan asked Luke to meet her at the Overlook. Not because it was romantic, because it was honest. That place held the weight of their old promises and their old mistakes. Luke arrived early, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the horizon like he was preparing to be judged. Megan walked up slowly, wind lifting strands of her hair. Luke turned, eyes cautious. "If this is too much, I'll leave," he said. Megan shook her head once. "No," she replied. "This time, you stay and listen." Megan stood beside the fence line, looking out over the fields that had watched her become steel. "When you left," she began, voice calm, "you didn't just break my heart." Luke's jaw tightened. "You broke my trust in safety," Megan continued, eyes fixed forward. Luke swallowed, but he didn't look away. "I rebuilt myself," she said. "Not to punish you, to survive." Luke's eyes shone. Megan turned to him slowly. "And I need you to understand this. If I let you love me again, it will be because you earned it, not because I forgot." Luke nodded, tears threatening but contained. "I don't want you to forget," he whispered. Megan's brow lifted slightly. Luke took a breath. "I want you to remember and still feel safe with me." That sentence hit Megan in the chest like a prayer, because it didn't ask her to erase the past. It asked him to become trustworthy in spite of it. Megan swallowed hard, fighting the tremble in her throat. "Can you stay when I doubt you?" she asked. Luke answered without hesitation. "Yes," he said, "even when it hurts." Megan's voice lowered, trembling now, not from weakness. "Check, honesty. I don't miss who you were," she admitted. "I mourned him." Luke flinched as if that truth was a knife. Megan continued anyway. "But I see who you're trying to become." Luke's eyes lifted, hope flickering, then he steadied it down, respectful. "I'm not trying," he said quietly. "I am becoming. Because I have to." Megan inhaled sharply, because he didn't make it about winning her. He made it about being a man worthy of staying. And Megan realized that was the kind of love she could believe in again. A long silence stretched between them, filled with wind and breathing. Megan reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A folded paper, old, worn at the edges. Luke's eyes narrowed, confused. "It's the grocery list from the night you left," Megan said, voice soft but steady. Luke's face tightened, pain rising fast. Megan unfolded it carefully. "I kept it," she admitted. "Not proud, not ashamed. I kept it because it was proof that my life was real, even when you walked out of it." Luke's breath broke and he looked like he might collapse under the weight. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice raw. Megan held up a hand. "No," she said gently, surprising herself. "Not that word." Luke froze. Megan's eyes burned, tears finally allowed but controlled. "Say you understand," she asked. Luke nodded, voice shaking. "I understand," he said. "I left you holding ordinary life alone." Megan nodded slowly. "Good," she whispered, "because ordinary life is where love proves itself." Luke stepped closer, carefully, like he was approaching a wounded animal. Reverent, patient. He stopped an arm's length away, waiting. Megan's heart thundered, fear and hope colliding. "I'm not giving you my heart like before," she said, voice low. Luke nodded. "I don't want it like before," he replied. Megan blinked, startled. Luke's gaze held hers. "I want it with your strength included, with your boundaries honored, with your whole life respected." Megan felt something inside her loosen, like a knot finally trusting release. Megan took one slow step forward, then another. Luke didn't move. He let her choose every inch. When she stopped close enough to feel his breath, she whispered, "If you leave again, I won't," Luke said, firm and quiet. Megan's eyes narrowed, testing. Luke added, "Not because I'm afraid of losing you, because I refuse to be that man again." That distinction mattered. It meant he wasn't staying for reward. He was staying because staying had become his character. Megan lifted her hand, hesitated, then placed it gently against Luke's chest. She felt his heartbeat, fast, real, human. Luke's eyes closed for a second like he was holding back tears. Megan's voice was barely a whisper. "Then prove it. Every day." Luke opened his eyes. "I will," he promised. And the promise sounded like labor, not poetry. Megan nodded, then let out a shaky breath that sounded like surrender and courage at once. Luke didn't grab her. He waited until she leaned in first. Megan kissed him slowly, not like a woman desperate to return to the past, like a woman choosing a future with open eyes. Luke's hands rose only after her body relaxed, resting lightly at her waist like he was afraid of disrespecting the moment. The wind moved through the fields, and the horizon looked softer than it had in years. When they finally pulled back, Megan rested her forehead against his, breathing steady. "This is a beginning," she whispered. Luke nodded, voice quiet and sure. "The kind I won't ruin." And for the first time, the love between them didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a home built with hands that planned to stay. Luke didn't treat that kiss like a finish line. He treated it like a responsibility. The next morning, he showed up the same way he always had since returning. Early, steady, quiet. Not with a speech, not with flowers, not with a public announcement that love had won. Just work boots on, hands ready, eyes soft with the kind of humility that doesn't fade when the moment passes. Megan watched him from the clinic van as the sun rose over the fields, and what moved her most wasn't romance. It was consistency. The way he stayed when there was nothing to gain but the chance to do right. The way he listened when her voice shook. The way he didn't rush her healing like it was an inconvenience. Because Megan didn't fall back into love. She stepped into it, slowly, wisely, with her strength intact. Luke kept his success, his company, his resources, the life he built away from town. But he brought that success back with a different purpose. He funded the mobile clinic without putting his name on the side of the van. He rebuilt the rural transport program so no farmer had to choose between health and harvest. He sat in hospital waiting rooms with families who had nothing to offer him, and he stayed until fear loosened its grip. And Megan didn't become soft again. She became safe again, safe in her own skin, safe to hope without begging, safe to love without disappearing. Weeks later, when spring finally warmed the nights, Luke took her back to the Overlook. Not to recreate the past, but to replace it. The sky was clear, stars sharp, and the town below glowed with small lights like steady witnesses. Luke didn't kneel for drama. He didn't give her a rehearsed speech. He simply took her hand, slow, careful, waiting until she didn't pull away. "I left to find myself," he said quietly, voice rough with truth. And I lost the only love that mattered. Megan's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. Luke inhaled, steadying. I'm not asking you to forget, he continued. I'm asking you to let me spend my life proving I understood. Megan's eyes filled, but her voice stayed strong. Then prove it, she whispered. Every day. Luke nodded, and the nod was a vow that didn't need poetry. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Not flashy, not loud, just honest. He didn't open it right away. He waited, letting her lead. Megan stared at him for a long second. The woman who had survived abandonment built herself from the rubble and learned to breathe alone. Then she stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady truth of his heartbeat. I'm not giving you the old me, she said softly. Luke's eyes shone. I don't want the old us, he whispered. I want the real one. Megan exhaled, a trembling release that felt like a door unlocking. Okay, she said. Not as surrender, as choice. Luke opened the box then, revealing a simple ring that caught the starlight like a promise made clean. He didn't rush her answer. He just watched her like she was sacred ground, like love was something you protect by staying gentle. Megan smiled through tears and leaned in first, kissing him with quiet certainty. The kind of kiss that doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't rewind time. A kiss that builds forward. When they pulled back, Luke rested his forehead against hers. I'm here, he whispered, and I'm staying. Megan's voice came soft but firm, the way truth always sounded on her. Then let's build something that can survive storms. And down in the town that had watched her break and rise, the clinic van sat ready for tomorrow. Proof that redemption wasn't a moment. It was a life. Because this time, love wasn't a promise Luke made at the edge of a road. It was a choice he lived. In the ordinary, in the hard, in the everyday. And Megan finally let herself believe the thing she thought she'd lost forever. That love can come back. Not to repeat the past, but to redeem it. If this story made you believe in love again, subscribe now. And comment, I choose love, so I know you stayed until the end.